Welcome, everyone. As we're waiting for more people to join us, please let us know in the chat where you're listening in from. We're going to get started momentarily. So I'm Natalie Applewhite, the Strategic Director of Development for the Pulitzer Center. And we're really grateful that you're all joining us today for the webinar, The Exit is Not the End, What's Next for Afghanistan? For those of you who have not joined us before, the Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism organization and education organization with the mission to elevate public engagement with underreported issues. While we're based in Washington, D.C., our staff and our work are global. We support more than 200 reporting projects each year in collaboration with news outlets around the world on the most critical issues of our time, including racial justice, migration, public health, climate change, and peace and conflict. We don't stop with the reporting. Our education programming spans from elementary schools to graduate degree programs and outreach to the broader public. Afghanistan has been the focus of 20-some projects we've supported over the years. And what we're seeing today illustrates the deep connection between local and global issues that is at the core of our mission and model. So a few logistics before we begin. Our aim is to incorporate audience questions as part of today's conversation. You'll see a Q&A icon on your screen. Please begin adding your questions as soon as something comes to mind during the conversation. There's also a chat icon on your screen. We'd appreciate it if you'd use the chat box only for specific technology issues. Note that all attendees are muted, but if you cannot hear us, let us know via the chat box. We also want to let everyone know that we're recording this session to post online at a later date. Now, I'd like to briefly introduce the moderator of today's conversation. Amna Nawaz is the chief correspondent and primary substitute anchor for PBS NewsHour. She has received numerous awards, including a Peabody and an Emmy. Prior to joining PBS, Nawaz was an anchor and correspondent at ABC News and a foreign correspondent at NBC News, covering Afghanistan, Pakistan, Syria, and beyond. The NewsHour has been one of the Pulitzer Center's strongest news partners over the years, and it's an honor to turn the program over to Amna, who's reporting for the NewsHour we've also supported directly. So welcome, Amna, and thank you.
Natalie, thank you so much for that warm welcome. And thank you to all of you out there for joining us today. And thank you to the Pulitzer Center for all your support of the journalism that we do and love to do and is so important, as is this topic. I'm incredibly honored to be leading this conversation today with three people from whom I have learned a great amount, and I'm sure you will too. If you have questions or comments, as Natalie mentioned, please feel free to just put them in the chat. I'll work them into the conversation and save some time at the end of my moderated conversation specifically for those. In the meantime, I do want to turn to our panelists now, who I hope will do more talking than I will. We've got three people here who know a great deal about Afghanistan. We're going to talk about what they've seen happen over these last several weeks of the US withdrawal and the establishment of an interim government, and also talk about their analysis, their expectations for what happens next. I'm really pleased to be joined by Nasema Zeerak, by Jane Ferguson, and by Jeffrey Stern. If you don't mind, I'm going to turn to each of you one by one, allow you to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself and your work, and your connection to Afghanistan. Nasema, why don't we start with you?
Sure, thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm Nasema. I'm a doctoral student at the University of Minnesota, where my research focuses on the relationships between international state building, military intervention, and its impact on local population. And I was born and raised in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. Jane, over to you.
Thanks, Amna. I'm a special correspondent for the NewsHour and a contributor to the New Yorker. I started covering Afghanistan as a print reporter when I was a real cub in 2009. And I returned after that to be the Al Jazeera English correspondent there, lived in Kabul for a while for them. And really when I started working for the NewsHour, I started returning to Afghanistan a lot as the situation has developed there. So from 2019 to now, we've done 6 trips in and out of Afghanistan, and hopefully we'll do more. But we've really ramped up our coverage from there, from on the ground, as the Trump administration started negotiating with the Taliban, right up to, of course, the Taliban takeover of Kabul and this evacuation. So it's been an intense amount of time on the ground in Afghanistan over the last few years. And I'm just very fortunate to have been able to see the changes that led up to this event, as well as the event itself.
And I just have to say, on a personal note, we are fortunate to be able to feature your reporting. It is some of the best work we have seen coming out of Afghanistan, particularly in these last few weeks. If you haven't watched it, please go to the NewsHour's website and check it out. And finally, I want to turn to Jeff Stern. Jeff, why don't you take it from here?
Well, so I first went to the country in it was actually 2007, I think, and my purpose was to be a freelance journalist. I had essentially no money, and I ended up getting a low-level job at the American University of Afghanistan there, and ended up there for a year. And so my sort of entree to the country was kind of moonlighting as a journalist, trying to write like blog posts and articles here and there, but was working in a very modest, low-level way on kind of development. And so I think because I was just out of college, I was sort of wearing multiple hats. It sort of worked its way into my into my heart and became kind of a second country in a way.
Well, let's jump into some of the more editorial issues now. And I'd love to start with you, Nasema, because there is now this conversation, particularly in the US, but also really across many of the US Western allies, NATO allies, about the end of the war, right? This is the end. And there's all this language about US leaves, the NATO allies leave, this is the end. You have written in great detail and very eloquently about how this is not necessarily the end of conflict and war there. So tell me a little bit more about this paper you recently wrote and what you mean by that, what you expect to happen next in Afghanistan.
Thank you, Amna. So yeah, absolutely. I think, as you mentioned, a lot of focus in the media has been on, on focusing on America, the troop withdrawal, what it means for Americans, what it means for their strategic and security interests. And I witnessed that in the weeks leading up to the fall of Afghanistan, and then after the fall and during the evacuation. Again, this very, the kind of reporting that is focused on, very, very US focused. This was reflected on the reporting of the airport scenes during the evacuation. There were, we all saw there were horrific scenes from the airport where Afghans were, in thousands trying to escape after having passed through the Taliban checkpoints, after being beaten and, treated very, very violently. In very desperate situations, I think, and after when the bombing happened, which killed, 170 people and wounded hundreds of more, the media reporting in the US, as I was witnessing it, was very, very focused on what it, the 13 US service military members that were killed. Of course, with the notable exception, for example, reporting that Pulitzer Center has done and Jane on the ground, but I think a lot of it was, some media outlets didn't even mention the hundreds of, Afghans who were killed and wounded. It was about the 13 US military members. And my co-author for the Open Democracy piece, Robert Cruz, who's a historian at the Stanford University, has provided a very important critical historical analysis to this moment, where, he argues that this is the general attitude of Americans towards Afghans. At the end of the day, Afghans are treated as dispensable. And when things have gotten difficult and complicated, Afghans really don't matter as much. I don't know how many of us saw, but the video of when there were videos being circulated on social media and Twitter where, when an Afghan who was beaten up by the Taliban, and if they were, treated violently, they were announcing that they had an American passport or they had an Australian passport. And this, shows that there is this implicit understanding and agreement that if you have an American passport, no one can hurt you, like the Taliban or their partners can't hurt you. So I think this shows that, how the world looks at Afghans and how the framing and the reporting has really been one-sided. And, there is this, so this is the evacuation part of it. And I think beyond that, immediately after the fall, I was sitting, watching the fall of Afghanistan and the news and media. And I witnessed there was this, insidious new kind of narrative taking hold. I saw that a lot of Afghans in Afghanistan who were reporting, usually I would follow them for updates, security and peace process. They were silent overnight. Everyone after the 15th, on the 16th, everybody went silent because out of fear. And then a lot of, again, with notable exception, a lot of non-Afghan reporters in Afghanistan or outside were trying to repackage and associate these new words with the Taliban that I was hearing for the first time. For example, changed Taliban, moderate Taliban, the whole that, they have like these very rhetorical questions. Are the Taliban gonna treat women, with respect and, grant them the rights that they have? Or are they going to, change from the 1990s? They have said all of that in paper. And so all of that narrative changed because the Taliban didn't really deliver on any of those empty promises. But you could see that there was this very real intention that people wanted to change that story and to actually, make the world and the people of Afghanistan believe that the story has changed and the Taliban have changed. And so this goes to show that, as you pointed out, that the framing has really affected, and the framing, has misled a lot of people. That it's sad how we're witnessing this now. I'll stop there.
No, you raised some excellent points. I do want to take a few of them one by one because they are also important. And Jane, I'll turn to you on this, because the idea of the narrative that was coming out of Afghanistan, particularly in Western media, you have been on the ground for years, and you and I have talked about this before. Talk a little bit about that gap between sort of the messaging you saw from officials, from people on the ground, versus what you as a reporter, as a journalist on the ground were seeing, and how that framed how the rest of the world saw what was happening in Afghanistan.
Sure, yeah. I mean, Nasema raises a whole host of some of the most important points. I agree with everything that she's saying. That first of all, when the bomb went off, and we literally saw headlines that were saying 13 Americans killed. There were 260 Afghans killed. And, this was huge. And so we did see it very starkly, what we know has been in place for a long time, which was that, that throughout this war, Afghan life has been massively less valued than the lives of US soldiers, and we've seen is like a kind of diminishing of Afghan sacrifices and the costs of the war. Even for Afghan security forces, you had President Biden saying they didn't stand up and fight, didn't mention that they've sustained some of the highest casualties known to any military around the world for the last few years, month in, month out. So, or that those soldiers weren't being paid. Some of them weren't even being fed. So the other point that I think really leads up to what Nasema was talking about with the media coverage in particular, that is the context for a lot of this, is that Afghanistan's been largely ignored by the media for the last 10 years. Now, I got to give the broadsheets their dues. Like the newspapers, the American newspapers did keep their bureaus fairly well stocked, and they've done a good job of hiring Afghan reporters, and we've seen more Afghan bylines in the American broadsheets. But American TV walked away from Afghanistan a long time ago. And, we were going in there, sometimes it was like only us and the BBC every time we were there. Vice might come, but generally speaking, anytime the US networks did go, not anytime, but more often than not, there wasn't so much of the reporting out across the countryside, like talking to Afghans in different areas of the country, or, women and women's rights. A lot of what we're seeing on the screens today, we haven't seen over the last 10 years. So you do have journalists coming in and perhaps from like pretty new to it, or haven't been talking to Afghan civilians for a long time, and so that has a huge impact. And just a quick point, what Nasema pointed out about the Taliban charm offensive against certainly the Western media, that sort of, and foreign media that came in. She's right. That was really successful for a while. For a while, people weren't saying, well, hold on a minute, it hasn't been 20 years since you ran the country. You've been running swathes of this country for the last 20 years, and there are no girls' schools open in any of the areas that you control. Or, hey, you're giving a press conference in the Serena Hotel in Kabul. Do you remember the time you sent fighters in here and they executed children in the restaurant? Like, there's a lot of tough questioning that perhaps perhaps we could have seen more of. And I think she's right that now we're starting to see that perhaps some of that, what contributed to that was that lack of Afghan journalists, those local experts who have lived through this for years, in the room, asking those tough questions. So when it's only left up to foreigners who are flying in, you do start to see a weakness there.
Jay, just to follow up on that, do you think the lack of investment by news organizations on the ground over those years, did it lead to a misunderstanding of what was really happening on the ground? I mean, I remember when the Washington Post published those Afghanistan papers and it hit like a ton of bricks as if it came out of nowhere, when really it was a compilation of accounts over years.
Absolutely. The Afghanistan papers is a great example. Like they, of course, did their own investigative work and dug up a lot of interesting and shocking new facts. But we were all getting those reports from the Special Investigator's Office ourselves. You're absolutely right. The lack of coverage of Afghanistan in the US media, certainly in broadcasting, and I'm not just tooting our own horn here, but at PBS we have covered it. But like at a lot of the networks, it's just those bureaus shut up years ago. That has had a huge knock-on effect on the American public, who can't really be blamed for not necessarily knowing what's been going on there. But another important point has been that the US military has gone out of its way to block the media from reporting in Afghanistan. We have not been granted access to bases. We've been blocked from embedding with Afghan security forces by Americans. We've been not granted access to US military commanders or soldiers for years. So there's been a concerted effort to sort of make sure that it's harder for journalists to really get in and get answers to questions. And that unfortunately has had an impact. When we start to see the conversations that have taken place in Washington, DC over the last few months, we see that. We see people saying, well, why can't we just stay? There's a misunderstanding there. People seem to think there was a stalemate. There wasn't a stalemate. The Taliban were always on the march, but that wasn't really being reported on the ground, at least from a broadcast sense.
Jeff, I want to bring you in here now and tell me a little bit about, in light of your time on the ground, when you were there reporting and building relationships, what it was like for you in those final weeks as you were watching the US withdraw and the chaos that we all saw unfold and the people struggling by the thousands to leave in those final weeks. What was that like for you? Tell me a little bit about what you were up to and how you were processing that.
This is a really good question. I mean, I think the short answer is not well. I think probably everyone on this panel has getting hundreds, if not thousands, of requests from people that we've worked with, or just that have seen the work and sort of see a lifeline. There was a period, I think back when Biden first made the announcement, that there was deep concern. It wasn't so acute back then, but it was, there was deep concern about what was going to happen if this actually happened, if the last several thousand troops pulled out this quickly. There was through some of my colleagues who were beginning to talk to different arms within the U.S. government, the State Department, the military, trying to figure out what the plans were. And there was a growing sense of alarm that there really just were not plans in place. And so while giving the benefit of the doubt, you could say that the speed of the Taliban takeover maybe, took some people by surprise. The fact that there were going to be tens of thousands of people who wanted and really needed to get out, in large part because of their association with us, was really entirely predictable. And so that last kind of month or two went from, trying to find exits with some urgency, but not emergency for vulnerable people on the ground. And at that point, it just meant, education visas, trying to get people into schools in the West, trying to get people, and even at that point, there were a lot of people without passports who needed to get out, I can remember distinctly, scholarships being offered, but for people who didn't have passports, and there was a passport office that was still ostensibly functioning, but as the Taliban march kind of increased and more cities fell, it became clearer and clearer that people were not going to be able to get passports, people who didn't have them. And of course, it's been a while since there's been a functioning US or UK consulate in the country for people to get, even people who have who have offers for jobs at universities. it's been months since people have been able to get, maybe years since people have been able to get even interviews for visas. So there was this sort of slow kind of horrible, mounting of fear from, there's a possibility people aren't going to get out, to when, my friends and people that we were trying to get out moved from, going every day to the passport office to beginning to think about going into hiding, to destroying documents, to, deleting contacts on their phone. And for me, and I think for a lot of colleagues, kind of commenced a period that's still going today of being sort of awake almost 24 hours because the time zones are reversed, and just trying every kind of harebrained idea to get people out, some of which have worked, and a lot of which haven't.
Can I follow up on that, Jeff, just to pull back the curtain a little bit, because I think all of us have been involved in these conversations at different degrees over the last several weeks. The line, if one exists, between continuing to do your job as a journalist, maintaining whatever distance you think that professionalism necessitates, right? But then helping people who you have known for years, with whom you have deep relationships, with whom you have worked before. How do you balance that? How do you think about that?
I think that's a really important question, and a good question, and a hard question. And I think for me, I've been somewhat lucky in that I haven't been covering Afghanistan as a journalist for a few years now. So it wasn't so acute for me to be, and I wasn't trying to write about anything that was going on now. I wasn't trying to cover it. I wasn't assigned to cover it. But I've thought about this a lot with other places, because we tend to go into, I'm sure Jane can speak to this even more compellingly than I can, but you go into places where there's a lot of need and a lot of suffering, and you sort of go in thinking, I can shed some light on this, and maybe that will indirectly leverage some attention to this. Maybe policy will be, but I think in the back of our minds, or often for me in the front of my mind is, I feel purpose here, but I also know that these words are not going to put food in mouths or gauze on wounds, and it's really tough. And I remember, this goes back to high school or college or something. I'd seen that image. We talked about this a few weeks ago, but of the naked girl in Vietnam who'd just been burned with napalm, and the famous image, and always wondering, that was such an impactful single image, and there's been a few of those from Vietnam especially, and people have talked a lot about the helicopter lifting off, et cetera. I think that those images have had a huge outsized impact in moving discussion and even moving policy. But how, as a journalist, photojournalist, print journalist, how do you square that circle where you have a human being in front of you who's suffering, and you have to decide, am I a journalist or am I a humanitarian? Am I human? And I remember reading, years later, years after sort of running that kind of that like crisis through in my head, reading that photographer took a picture really quickly and then grabbed the girl and drove 4 hours to a hospital. And they apparently, then when she grew up, they toured together and talked about ethics and war. And it sort of blew open for me the idea that you kind of have to be one or the other. And now, of course, you have to be careful, because the moment someone thinks that, or even catches a whiff that you're going to offer some kind of financial or other kind of, recompense for their cooperation, I think that now you're in unethical territory, and then you don't know when someone is cooperating because they expect something from you. But I think that for me, the lesson is there are ways to be able to do both. And fortunately for me, I was not professionally obligated to be covering the last few months as a journalist. And if I were ever to write about it, I would have to be, extraordinarily clear that, first of all, I am not an objective observer, and second of all, the people that I'm engaged with here are not subjective sources.
Jane, I'd love for you to weigh in on this, because this was something you managed really beautifully and eloquently in your reporting. So I'd love for you to join in here. And then Nasema, I'll come to you to move us forward to where we are now. But Jane, over to you.
It's such a weighty, fundamental part of what it is that we do. This guilt that we live with, the fact that I walk into a refugee camp and sometimes people will walk up to me with their sick kids because they think I might be a doctor. That's a terrible feeling when you get your little notepad out and you're like, oh, I'm just a journalist and I'm here. And, you know, covering famine is something I've done a lot. And that's a pretty awful feeling whenever you have cash in your pocket and someone can't afford to feed their children and you're interviewing them. I've ended up, just talking about what Jeffrey's mentioning there, I've ended up helping people and therefore not being able to use the interview that we've done, you know, and that's seems like a perfectly reasonable sacrifice to me, but you do have a job to do on the same day. So you're often like picking between those who you helped, or maybe, you know, maybe you found out about a drug that they needed that was in a clinic 10 miles away and you're the only person with a car. So you don't profile that person. But yes, I mean, it's very important that people understand when they talk to you that you are not there to help them, but then you actually do want to help people, and you do help people all the time, but delineating between them is hard. So I came at this story with all of that experience, and yet I've never struggled more to sort of balance my, not objectivity, because that's something that you have or you haven't. I mean, that's simply, you know, being honest about what's in front of you. There's no kind of bias about people, about what's happening. I have eyes and ears, but sometimes there were times when my day would be split between trying to help colleagues get out and then trying to actually go and turn around a piece. I got to work to deadline. They need the piece for the show tonight. And so, and that line between aid work or whatever it was, logistical support for people, became all the more difficult because you're in a bizarre privileged position. You know, there were 8 journalists at the Baron Hotel at the airport, and the 8 of us had this weird power where, you know, if we found someone in the crowd who had a visa to go to France and their kids with them, I could sort of pull them forward and negotiate with the soldiers and get them through the gate. And that's unfair, but that is still true. And maybe I could help this person. And so, you know, I've discussed this with my colleagues over the last few weeks, like, you know, racking our brains about what's ethical and what's not ethical. And we've been talking a lot about, you know, like, is it fair that we helped our colleagues who needed help and who are genuinely in danger get out, but then maybe there's someone else who also, you know, like, who also needs help, and we didn't reach to them because we didn't know about them. And, you know, and what I ended up sort of, what helped me sleep at night was thinking, well, the thing was that we weren't cheating a system, the system had collapsed. So when people came to us and said, please help, they're here, they're wearing this colored hat, this is their name, these are their visas, like, can you get them onto the base and get them onto a flight? Then, you know, who would say no, you know? But it's hard. It's very hard to pick a person and help them and then walk past 1,000 people crying out to you. And all the while you're a reporter, you know, you're working to deadline. So you're trying to balance that human and professional part of you.
Nasema, I see you nodding along to what you're hearing Jane talking about and Jeff talking about. You want to weigh in on this before I move us forward?
No, not necessarily, but just, I think, just thinking how incredibly difficult task it is. And I think I paid a lot of attention to what Jane was speaking about, you know, this inverse, like, you know, the power dynamic that, yes, a group of journalists are there in this hotel and the kind of power that they have. And I think what you mentioned about the collapse of the system really resonated with me, I think, because that's what it was. There was a collapse of the system. But no, we can move on.
Well, I do want to get all of you to weigh in on where we are now and a little bit of what happens next, if we can dare to venture there, only because there is so much uncertainty. And I see some questions starting to come in now. Just a reminder to everyone out there who's with us, thank you so much for being here. If you put your questions into the Q&A function, we will try to work them into the conversation. So thank you for that. But Nasema, I want to ask you about something you mentioned in your first answer, which was what we're seeing already. You know, the questions that were being asked about whether this is a new Taliban leadership, Taliban 2.0 or whatever it is, whether the promises they were making on paper would eventually be lived up to. And already we've seen all of those collapse, right? This is not what anyone would call an inclusive government, even if it is interim. They have already dramatically scaled back the rights and freedoms of women and ethnic minorities. I'm curious how you are viewing all of this. You clearly are not surprised, like anyone else who's been watching the country for years, but also what kind of leverage you think the US or other powers should be using. Humanitarian aid, if that should be leveraged, how you think any of these rights could be secured or protected in the future?
I think that's a good question. And I think a lot of us who are watching what is happening in Afghanistan are puzzled by it, because I think in a lot of ways, we didn't expect that this will lead to this, but also in some ways, I think I personally am surprised that how come we're witnessing today the fall of a country. And, after 20 years of intervention and work and investment, how come we are in this position, and how all of us are feeling so helpless? Afghans inside, outside, I think we're incredibly disappointed and feel betrayed and just feeling, lost that, yes, what can be done? I think, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of, what can, in terms of what should be done next, right? I think it's a hard question, and I touched on for example, the rights for minorities or the rights for women. I think when the U.S. went to Afghanistan, and I'm just going to use this example of how the example of Afghan women and how we can and what that means for the broader issues in Afghanistan. The women's right was a central theme and messaging of U.S. Government in 2001 in Afghanistan, and I think I believe this was an instrumentalization of their rights, their freedoms, and their voices. And this was obvious when in 2020, when the U.S. government signed a deal with the Taliban. Afghan women and their rights were basically an afterthought. It was a banality. And the same way that now that the Taliban has retaken the country, Afghan women are left to fend for themselves. I think a lot of people are just ready to move on. And in the last 20 years as well, I feel like the way that, these, the rhetoric and the story of saving Afghan women and, their rights, their freedoms, it was spoken from the premise that, the premise of saving Afghan women, which originates from the colonial logic of saving brown women from brown men by white men. And I think that lens and that kind of thinking really compromised a lot of important work that could have been done. Afghan women are, in a way, imagined as individuals, as, this entity separate from their localities, from their histories, from their context. And so this idea, this obsession that if we save one victim, Afghan woman, into, like a strong, independent woman, somehow that will solve the problem, the problems of the entire, Afghan woman. And so speaking in this very monolithic term, and I'm not even just talking about the urban-rural area, distinction. I think in rural areas, Afghan women are incredibly diverse, with diverse aspirations, needs, and demands. And so we see some of these, the consequences of this kind of framing and this kind of understanding surface in some of the gender programs and the broad development programs that surface. But also there's another important consequence to that, Wajma Osman, who's an Afghan American professor at Temple University, she talks about this in her latest book, that when there's this over obsession of Afghan women, for example, and their rights and their freedoms, Afghan people are forced to react to that. They're forced to speak back to that and to talk back to that. And Afghan policymakers and institutions have been able to do that, sometimes with decrees, with rules and regulations, and other times, with violence. And so this becomes like a gender war where there is, issue of women are turned into this politicized and this violent back and forth between the West and Afghanistan, because they're basically forced to talk back and to react to this. So, that using that example to understand that, where we are now and specifically in terms of women's rights and women's advancements, moving forward, what can be done, and if there is any expectation for the US or international community to do anything. I think myself and there are a lot of other Afghans who are incredibly disappointed, and we just feel betrayed. I think the way that the issue of women was instrumentalized, I feel like, and how they're left on their own moving forward, I think there is not much hope. In terms of the humanitarian crisis, I mean, we see there's a catastrophic humanitarian crisis unfolding. I think I saw reports of how the country will, be in the brink of a break. By sometime next year, there will be extreme poverty. And the aids are, there's the conversation of unfreezing the aids. I don't know what is gonna, I honestly don't have a good answer. I don't know what's gonna happen. I certainly hope that there is some, using the leverage of not recognizing the Taliban government in order to not punish the Afghan people. But at the end of the day, I don't know how that will work out in reality. I'm sorry, I know I didn't have a very good and straightforward answer to a question.
No, that was actually an incredibly illuminating answer, because I think it gets to the point, which is there is so much uncertainty, right? Where we don't yet know how US leverage or any other international leverage will be deployed. And I think that sense of betrayal and disappointment that you expressed is something we've heard from so many. And Jeff and Jane, I want to come to each of you in turn now on an issue related to what Nasema is mentioning, which is just how will we know about what's unfolding on the ground? When Nasema had mentioned, of course, so many Afghan journalists going underground, going into hiding with this uncertainty ahead, and much of the foreign press leaving. Will attention just sort of fade? Will we even know what's unfolding on the ground? And then I do want to turn to some audience questions. Thank you to everyone who's out there sending them in. I will turn to them next, but Jeff, let me get you to weigh in on that quickly. Are you worried we'll lose sight of what's happening?
Yeah, and I think, and to Jane's point earlier, I mean, I think we had, I think until there was this sort of acute moment of collapse, we largely looked away. I mean, we were sort of bored with Afghanistan. I think a lot had, and to the extent anyone was covering it, it was the capitals. I mean, it was mostly Kabul, which, in fairness, that we sort of have that same problem with domestic coverage, and we've seen that over the past few years. But yeah, and I think actually, I think of sort of Syria, where the Assad regime did such a remarkable job for so long of making it so hard and dangerous for journalists, that I think it becomes, if you don't have images, if you don't have TV coverage, then it's hard to sort of walk into a newsroom, even of a broadsheet, and say we should be covering this. Things tend to fade. And I've sort of long thought that at least the American news consuming public has the appetite for maybe one international story at a time, if that. So I don't know that we will know. I think some of us will are committed to this place, and we'll keep following it, and we'll be sort of tearing our hair out trying to get other people to pay attention. But I think that there's almost a psychic interest in not paying attention. I think that for if you look at this administration, that they would love nothing more than for us to not pay attention anymore. And I think that they, notwithstanding the efforts of some local journalists who just continue to sort of push forward, and whatever press operation the Taliban sort of stand up, I do worry that that's what will happen.
Jane, what's your take on that?
Agree with Jeffrey entirely, especially when we look at things like, look at the regimes that have succeeded in pushing their atrocities or their crises off the news agenda. It works because they understand the media. They understand, look at, how little reporting you see out of Iran, or how little reporting you see out of Syria. These things work. Even, Saudi Arabia, if you can't get access, it's all about access. If you cannot get access, eventually journalists go somewhere else where there is access. One last point I would say is that, one of the frustrations of media coverage can be staying on a story generally. I mean, we don't stay on stories. Look at South Sudan today, look at Yemen today, look at stories that have been really big in the news. It's not because we don't care or that we're horribly fickle, but there is a tendency within the media generally, if a story isn't moving forward, if there aren't new developments, if it's the more of the same, it's a really hard sell as a reporter when you're pitching more of the same. And so I worry that Afghanistan will become a bit like that, where it'll become like the nuances of uprisings and divisions and inter-Taliban politics and humanitarian crises. And that is simply not big enough of a development to send a team in. So I think that impacts how much coverage it gets generally across the board in broadcasting.
Let's turn now to some of these audience questions. And Jane, I'll start with you on this. And Nasema and Jeff, if you want to jump in, please feel free to. But the first question, Jane, comes from Teresa. Teresa, thank you for your question. Teresa asks, she's interested in your thoughts on why the Biden administration set a hard deadline of August 31st. She says that seems to have almost been an invitation to chaos. The administration couldn't have been blind to that fact, could they? Jane, what do you make of that? Oh, you are muted.
Yeah, there we go. Hard deadlines and wars have always had an uncomfortable relationship, because if you're looking at a military reality on the ground versus a political reality, then they can be clashing. Do you remember when when President Obama announced that there would be a surge, but then it would end? I mean, that was from a military perspective, that was criticized as saying, well, you've just given them a date to hold out until. And so, you could say the same thing about what happened here. As soon as Biden made the announcement in April, I believe, that this would be an unconditional drawdown, plans for peace talks in Istanbul collapsed, or in Turkey collapsed. Those are canceled immediately. It had an immediate effect on the actions on the ground towards peace. And I do think that anybody who feels as though in retrospect that could have impacted the Taliban's behavior, there is some truth to that. Deadlines are good in sound bites. People like political leaders want to be able to tell their people something solid. They don't want to stand at a podium and say, hopefully, maybe we'll leave if the right conditions. That sounds like more of the same. So if you're a political leader trying to sort of put across that you're different, that you're serious, this is ending, a deadline is what you want to say. But how that impacts, armed groups on the ground, what politicians are doing, how that'll impact organized peace talks, is huge and massively, problematic.
Jeff, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one point, which is, not really a journalism point, but I keep thinking about this because back in 2007, there were people beginning to push for negotiations with the Taliban, and this is when U.S. and NATO had 150,000. I don't know what the number was, but well over 100,000 troops, and the country was arguably as stable from a sort of U.S. war perspective as it had been since. The attitude then towards the prospect of negotiating with the Taliban was anyone who would say that was essentially a radical, if not a sympathizer with the Taliban themselves. How that would have gone, who knows? We'll know. And I don't say this because of hindsight is 2020, but because this will happen again. We will be in a situation like this that looks not exactly the same, but is a similar sort of long-term engagement. And there will be a group with whom we will sort of define ourselves against. And it will be seen as treason to negotiate with them. And then, of course, the irony is here, we ended up negotiating with the Taliban when we were doing it from a position of extraordinary weakness. We had no negotiating power. Whatever concessions they would have made in 2007. I mean, who knows what would have happened? But I think it's worth. I mean, my personal attitude, because I don't have to meet daily deadlines, and what I work on is sort of longer form articles and books, has been, what does this mean going forward? What does this mean for the next Afghanistan? And that's the thing I keep coming back to. Is what if you seized an opportunity like that? If indeed it was an opportunity when you had it.
Nasema, let me put to you another question from an audience member. This comes to us from Nasir. This speaks to the uncertainty, because I don't know that there's necessarily an answer, but I'm curious your thoughts on the topic. Nasir is asking, what's the US plan for those Afghans who are living in neighboring countries? Do you think we have enough details yet? Have you heard about how, for the many people who have now been relocated to these lily pad countries, as they're called, that are in agreement with the US to house evacuees, but also people who have just moved as they can on their own to neighboring countries?
So I think earlier, Jeff and Jane touched on this as well. I think a lot of us immediately after the fall of Afghanistan, all of us were inundated with messages, emails, texts, and calls about, we need support, we need to get out. And I think during those days and nights, I was going through this, trying to wrap my head around the idea that my country has fallen and what that means for me emotionally, personally, what is my identity and my passport. But I was also working on a lot of these efforts, try to get as many people, my own family members, my cousins, trying to, get them out. And looking at the, SIV application forms, P1, P2, it was very, very frustrating to work through all of that, because to me, it seemed like all of these were designed not to help anyone. They were, the bureaucracy that we're all familiar with. And so I was coming across lists online, forms, and all of that. It almost seemed like we're filling these forms and it goes into the dark hole, and I don't know what happens to them next. In theory, people who are out in a neighboring country in Pakistan, or like, I don't know, in Turkey, and if they have been, working with American government, with troops, then they can fill out these forms, and, maybe there's a way for them to get out. But I don't know what these looks like. And I've heard, conversations around how things are shifting just because of how badly the evacuations were handled, and how there is a humanitarian parole process. I think maybe it's still too soon to tell, but there are conversations around how to get those people who are in the neighboring countries out.
Jeff, do you have any insight to this?
No insight, just I sort of feel your pain, Nasir. I think it's extra frustrating because with the priority visas in particular, those are only supposed to be administered from a secondary country. So there were some people who were had opportunities to get on, some kind of evacuation flight and maybe end up, on a military transport that went through Doha and end up in US in one of these camps that maybe is going to parole people out with some kind of green card or something, and had that decision of, well, I have a strong case for P1 or P2, but I can only pick that up in an intermediary country. And so I'll go to an intermediary country. Kind of all I can do is sort of apologize that it has been so disorganized. And, we talked earlier about how the system collapsed, and I would argue that there kind of wasn't a system. I do sense that there's a recognition now, at least at fairly high levels of the U.S. government, that there needed to be more, and there needs to be more now, and that we're sort of trying to kind of claw this back and build something. There's been a lot of airplanes that have been built kind of in flight, and so I'm sort of apologetic and sympathetic, but also a little bit hopeful that we're getting our stuff together.
You are hopeful. That's interesting.
Moderately.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll take that. Am I right in assuming, by the way, that all of us, I think, are still involved in some way in trying to get people out, right? Those are all still very much, yep, I thought so. Everyone is nodding. Jane, I want to come to you with another question from an audience member. This comes to us from Janine. Janine, thank you for your question. Janine also says her middle school students are watching. So thank you to all of you for watching. And they are interested in knowing, as journalists, how you knew you would be able to exit Afghanistan yourselves, and also what scared you the most about being there. Jane, do you want to take that first?
That's a really good question. How to get out of anywhere is a big part of planning coverage of a conflict. And this trip was the hardest. I've never in my whole career questioned myself and my decisions more. My cameraman and I, Eric, were in Dubai airport late at night, waiting to board this flight. And we got off the bus that would take us from the terminal building to the plane twice, and stood in the tarmac and had a panicked conversation saying, are we crazy? Is this a really bad idea? Will we get there and find that everybody else has left and we're the only journalists there, and not in a good way? So we were really, really nervous about this. And because we weren't sure how we would get out, we knew that these evacuation flights would eventually end. But we didn't, and we knew the Taliban were about to take over the city. So we questioned that a lot. In the end, when we got there, we knew that we could get out on an evacuation flight when we needed to, but that with each day passing, that window to leave would be smaller and smaller and smaller. And that if we stayed on after all of the Western forces and Americans and British had left, that we didn't have an exit strategy at all, that the airport would shut, and that we didn't have visas for Pakistan if we wanted to go over the overland. So we knew we had to get on an evacuation flight, but we wanted to cover this story until the very end. The British who were hosting us within that hotel compound that became a military base came to us and said, look, tomorrow we're evacuating ourselves. We hand over this facility to the Taliban in the morning. You have to leave today. So we moved over onto the actual flight line, the tarmac, where they take off, the planes take off. And the Americans said, you need to get on the next plane, because in the days that follow, it's only going to be Americans and our equipment. So we stayed as late as we could, but obviously when we got to Doha and found out the next morning that the explosion had taken place, we felt very torn about the fact that, could we have stayed longer? Should we have stayed longer? Every journalist asked themselves that question.
Nasema, can I turn to you on this question? There's a lot of folks asking about the impact of the Taliban takeover just on the general functioning of the country, most specifically on the economy right now, not even mentioning securing rights for parts of the population. But what do you see already unfolding when it comes to this interim government taking shape? And how are you kind of viewing that, especially just regards specifically to the economy so far?
I think that's a hard question because, again, I think a lot of it we're just witnessing how it unfolds. From what I've seen so far, I think there aren't any positive signs. A lot of the previous, when Afghanistan fell, a lot of the officials from the previous government, if they could leave, they left. And then there were others who were, I think a lot of people are still in hiding in Afghanistan, people who work with the previous government. And then I see there are some people who have, stayed on to continue their jobs, somewhat, the kind of jobs that they had in the government institutions, which were probably not controversial. And so they are still in place. But I see reports of how the Taliban are replacing them. And for example, the new director of the Kabul University, they brought in this, they replaced the director, and a lot of people are unhappy about that. Students are protesting that, and the conversation is that this person is not qualified. He shouldn't be the head of the Kabul University. And so that's one example. And so I think immediately after the fall, Taliban also realized that when Afghans are storming out and leaving, how are we going to run the country? Because people leaving, Afghans leaving means that there won't be anyone who have experience, the skills, the capacity to run the government. And so I think their nervousness was right that after at some point there were talks about how the Taliban weren't letting Afghans leave the country, and I think that was for good reason. So that is to say, I think the country, the economy is on the brink of a collapse. There is no, there is no money. There is no, the food supplies are endangered, and from what I'm seeing, it's not looking good. It's an incredibly difficult situation, I think.
Jane, do you want to weigh in on that too?
Yeah, I think Nasema raises an important point about the brain drain. The Taliban initially were happy to let people rush to the airport. Many of them, the most educated people in the capital. Now they're realizing that's going to hit their pocketbook. Like they can't, if the country collapses economically, they are going to face pushback. That pushback, people are going to have to get desperate before they do push back, because it's very scary, the prospect of going out and confronting the Taliban. But they could end up with bread riots on their hands. I mean, people with starving children are going to have very little to lose, and they know that. So I don't think they have a vision for a modern economy, but I do think that some of their leadership is going to understand that this is a direct existential threat, economic collapse, and it'll come at them from various angles with 38 million people who can't feed their families.
Jane, I'll stick with you on this next question from Michael in the audience. Michael, thank you for your question. And then Nasema or Jeff, if you'd like to weigh in, please just let me know. But Michael is asking, and Jane, I know you've done some reporting on this, how would you describe the current resistance efforts in Afghanistan to the emerging Taliban rule? Jane?
It's very, from my apartment here in Manhattan, it's very hard to know. I was taking calls from the inner circle of Ahmed Massoud as recently as a couple of weeks ago, him being the sort of Tajik militia commander up in the Panjshir Valley, and they were desperate for international help, which they weren't getting. So armed resistance, the traditional image of it, I don't see it, right now. But the likelihood of resistance to the Taliban in the future is almost a certainty. And unfortunately, the road between here and there is a very painful one. It'll involve economic collapse. It'll involve people pushing back against a kind of repressive rule. The Taliban now rule, and any dictatorship any regime has learned this, that what you resist persists, and this is the existential crisis that they'll be with. Do they crack down on resistance, in which case it gets even more tough and more people rise up against them, and then they have to crack down even harder, and then they find themselves in that vicious cycle? I think that's very likely. One point that I would make, however, about any resistance to Taliban rule is this is a very different Afghanistan from the late 90s, not just because people are educated and worldly and connected in a literal sense online, but because people have tools. Afghans are on WhatsApp, they're on Signal, they're on IMO. This having to crack down on this kind of potential uprising will be much harder for them. And those of us who have covered the Arab Spring understand more what young people with iPhones can do. So I think that resistance or kind of like after this moment of shock and fear, a pushback, I do think it's inevitable. And I think it's going to be something the Taliban will struggle with. But details are very hard to get from where I'm sitting.
Nasima, I'm curious for your take on this. Is resistance inevitable?
I think reiterating a lot of the things that Jen mentioned, I think it's hard to tell with the resistance that's happening in Panjshir. I think I see mixed reports of how, the leaders have left the country. I don't know how accurate that is or not, because they were really, counting on the international support, but they didn't get any. So I'm not sure about that, but I think in the long term, Afghans are not going to not resist. I think for a lot of Afghans, it's a matter of, living under the Taliban regime. And I think for the same reasons that Jane mentioned, Afghanistan is not the country that it was in the 1990s. For minorities, for religious minorities, ethnic minorities, for women, I mean, after the 20 years, I think there is going to be resistance. And in the few weeks that the Taliban have been governing, I think we have seen their modality of governing. I mean, they have immediately banned women from having a public life. They are told that, if you have this rank in the government, you're not allowed to work anymore. Women are not allowed to go to school. They can't run the government institutions. So I think in the long term, I'm not sure how it will play out, and that's yet to be seen, but there is going to be popular resistance for sure.
Jeff, I'll turn to you. We have about a minute left before I hand it back to Natalie, but I'll come back to you because you were the only one in the conversation to mention the word hope. And so I'm going to give you a final chance here to share your final thoughts on some of what we've talked about and what you think the next few weeks, months hold, especially as we as journalists continue to try to cover this story.
Well, first of all, I think it's really contingent on us continuing to cover the story. And one thing I didn't mention before, that I suspect it's also going to become more difficult because there are fewer, if any, Americans there, and it's hard to get it's hard to get editors, it's hard to get readers, it's hard to get viewers. I would submit to pay attention to a story regardless of how important they are. If there's not, I think we saw this with the bombing. Most of us can probably quote 13 American servicemen killed. And it often gets just dropped that over 200 Afghans were killed. But I think that of just a sociological sort of certainty that's sort of how it happens. When it's a lot of people and when it's not your people, it's harder for people to sort of to consume it. So I think that it's going to be contingent on us finding ways, and Jane has talked about this too, about like finding ways of making this not just be relevant, but feel relevant, feel proximate, even though it's now it's beginning to feel to me like Yemen, where it's a country with not a lot of American presence, where there is very important things happening and there's not a lot of coverage. If there is, one second here, sorry.
The journalist job is never done. We don't get to put things on hold, I'm afraid. Let's see if Jeffrey joins us in a moment. There he is.
It's a landline. So the one thing that gives me some degree of hope, and it's not, I hope I'm not naive, but this has brought to light what a huge amount of just intellectual capacity there is in the country and also among people who've gotten out. So there's this, there will be Afghan institutes of, primary, secondary, and higher education outside of Afghanistan, whether literally or just sort of in spirit. And I think these communities are going to find each other, and I think that we're all going to be better for it. So I have some hope that at least in exile, that all is not lost.
That is Jeffrey Stern and Nasema Zeerak and Jane Ferguson. I am so grateful to all of you for taking the time to join in this conversation today. Thank you to the Pulitzer Center for hosting us. And I believe now is the point in the conversation in which I turn it back over to Natalie. Natalie?
Yes. Thank you so much to Jane, Jeffrey, Nasema, and Amna for a truly insightful and nuanced conversation. I'm also very grateful to my colleagues at the Pulitzer Center, Holly Rosewood and Ethan Ehrenhaft especially, who are our producers for this session. And we so appreciate all of you in the audience for joining us and sharing our commitment to reporting and conversations that illuminate our understanding of the most critical issues of our times, and for the terrific questions. Thank you all for participating. I was so excited to see a middle school joining in the group, and that's so important to us at the Pulitzer Center to have that engagement at a young age. And so thank you. And if you're not already part of our education network, we're going to follow up with you, Janine. And for those of you who are able, please support our mission via the link in the chat. We are a nonprofit journalism organization, and we do depend on donors like you to carry on our work. I see a number of our donors that are here with us, so thank you again for making this work possible. You can also learn about upcoming events and how to register at pulitzercenter.org/events. And one last favor, we'd so appreciate if you could click the link in the chat to take our 2021 annual audience survey. We're looking for feedback from all Pulitzer Center audiences and readers on what we're doing well and what we could do better, and the reporting issues that are important to you. So please do take a minute to fill that out. It's very brief. And thank you again for being with us. We do hope you'll join us again soon. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.